Siddhartha Khosla, you are a double Emmy nominee this year for Only Murders in the Building for composing the theme and the score. I want to start with the theme, which is incredible and really encapsulates the world of the Arconia. It's kind of sneaky and quirky and melancholy. And I know you sent John Hoffman, the showrunner, a motif, and he immediately said that's the theme. So how did you come up with it, and what was your reaction when he said that? Like, that's it.
My background in music is a songwriter, and so before I ever composed anything, and so for me, I always hear everything around a melody. It's always like the first thing. So I read a script, and if I'm lucky enough and I have a good day, I'm on a good day, I'll have like a melodic idea that just comes out of it, and then it just starts the process. So for the Only Murders theme, I heard this like do da 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 da, and I just, and you know, so much of my influence too from my band days comes from like 1960s stuff like the Beach Boys and Donovan and the Beatles, and so there's this quarter note pulse that's happening. It's this like, you know, plucky piano thing that I'm doing. It's just like it's like a three chord progression, and then it shifts to like a second section after that. But I sort of came up with that melody and those changes, and I played it for John over the phone. It was over like a Zoom call early on, and he's like, "What is that?" And I was like, "I don't know. I'm just like, this is just something that I've got." And I think in my mind I was like, "There's no way this is like anything." Like I think that's like the beauty of collaboration too. You know, it takes somebody that you're working with to like believe in what you're doing too. Because I certainly never really believe in the stuff that I'm doing. I just do it, and then somebody oftentimes is like, "That's the thing. Let's go with it," and that inspires me to keep going. So John immediately heard that, and he was like, "That makes me feel equal parts sad as it does happy, mysterious and melancholic, lonely, and I feel like something's afoot, you know, as well." So it happened to sort of cover those bases for him, and yeah, it just became the theme of the show, the main theme of the show.
It's so versatile too, because you reimagine it so many times throughout the whole season, and now in season 2 as well. So how do you go about just varying it up throughout the episodes and like whatever the scene calls for?
Yeah, you know, I think there was, you know, I've worked a lot with Dan Fogelman as well on This Is Us, and Dan is one of the producers on this show as well, and something that I learned sort of, you know, working with all those guys is it's never there's nothing wrong with sort of like sticking with a theme, and don't shy away from it if it's a good one. And it creates something incredibly filmic, you know. It's like, you know, especially when you have an ensemble cast, and you have so many different players in a show, you know, just like we had with This Is Us, or we have now with Only Murders. Only Murders has got, you know, all these amazing players that come into the picture, that you have all these people who live in these different apartments in the building. So having sort of, you know, a few sort of thematic threads that go through the whole thing keep it all together. And for me, so much of it was early experimenting. Like I experimented early on, even before I saw a picture, with just different sounds, and I wanted to hear that theme, you know, because I knew that theme, the main title theme, has that sort of like very sort of like 60s quarter note pulse with that percussion, which are those Home Depot buckets and the vocals and all the strings. That doesn't really work in the show as itself, because then it reads sometimes a little comedic in the show, and the show is like, I mean, I'm scoring it like it's like a drama, like a prestige drama is sort of the approach, like stay away from the comedy, and so, you know, there is this sense. You know, the show, it takes place in the Arconia, which is this pre-war building. And so I always like to think of the sound of the show as what it sounds like inside the walls of the Arconia. And so we were fortunate enough to have, you know, an orchestra play on every episode of this score. And I think with just like, you can be creative with the way you orchestrate stuff. A melody like that could be really romantic too if you slow it down. It could also be really dark if like you change the voicings underneath, or you don't change the chords underneath and you're just pedaling on like the tonic and low octaves. It can feel menacing all of a sudden. So I think when we committed to that melody, we were able to sort of adapt. And also, this is a team effort, you know, like I've got wonderful orchestrators that work on the show with me. You know, some of the guys that like worked on like Wes Anderson scores, Wes Anderson film scores, and which is also very appropriate sort of like,
yeah, definitely.
You know, that this fits in that world a little bit. The Grand Budapest, that kind of thing. And so it's a team effort, you know. Obviously I can write this but the orchestrators are playing a big part of helping sort of change it up too.
Well, your nominated episode is the best episode of season 1. I think everyone will agree. The Boy from 6B, which is told from the perspective of Theo, and it's dialogue free. So your music is most of the audio that we, the audience, hear during the episode. So how did you approach this episode when you found out what the premise was?
It's interesting because this is a completely silent episode of television. It was a big swing for the show, told from Theo Demas's perspective, and it's all communicated via ALS, you know, in the whole episode. So things that you hear are score, and you hear the incredible sound design from our sound design team, and it's basically the sound is what it sounds like from inside from the perspective of somebody who is deaf and who has that impairment. And again, it's collaboration. Julie Monroe, our editor, was key in this. Shireen Devis, who directed the episode, key. And so we all worked together very early on in terms of finding what it was. At one point, there was going to be no music. It was just going to be sound design. But then as we were cutting and seeing picture, all of a sudden we decided, no, there needs to be a lot of music to help drive the narrative here. And honestly, it's like I credit our editor. She was just really, really great about knowing where we wanted music. I worked with her too in places on that. You know, the music also was under a microscope now for the first time, really in series. And so every note mattered, every sound mattered. The melodies, I brought the melodies out more because the melodies sort of, normally when I'm scoring something, the dialogue is sort of like the lead singer and I'm the band around it, you know? And in this case, there was no dialogue. And so the melodies had to really tell the story. And it was challenging for sure. Cause like, you know, but it was so much fun. I remember when we started it, I was really like, how are we going to do this? This is going to be really challenging. Like I've never scored a silent movie before, anything like that.
But it was really great because I love, like, especially in scenes between Zoe and Theo, there was music because it's kind of romantic, but also sad because obviously now she's dead. And then as you were saying before, you know, adapting the theme when he pushes her off the rooftop, it's very dramatic. And it's like a string rendition and it's like a full orchestra for the fall. So and so what was there like any section of that episode that was particularly hard, or was it just like the whole thing?
The whole thing was a challenge. I think that the challenge of that episode really was spotting it. You know, it was like, how much music do we want? Like, when do we really want it to drive the story? When do we want the ALS portion of it to drive the story? And I think that, you know, again, like, as anyone on this panel can tell you, like, there's incredible composers on this panel who are very, very experienced, or more experienced than I am in many ways. But, you know, spotting an episode is everything. You know, it's like where you decide to put music and where you decide not to. And I think that ultimately was a challenge. And it could have been wall to wall. I could have scored the whole thing. It would have lost its magic. But I think here, that was the challenge of like, when do we want to score? One thing that we did realize in the process was this also had to be some of the biggest score of the season. You know, we didn't want to rely too much on like the smaller. There are some smaller intimate moments, but as you said, that moment where he pushes her off the roof is like the most operatic we'd ever been in season, and the score there is, you know, I had to sort of, you know, make it as sweeping and operatic as possible because it was the only thing driving it, but you couldn't hear what anybody was saying.
Yeah.
But again, again, I keep on going back to the collaboration. It's just like the performance from Theo in that is just heartbreaking. Nathan Lane is heartbreaking in it. I mean, it's a tremendous episode. I'm just lucky to be part of it.
Yeah, for sure. Lastly, you earlier referenced the Home Depot buckets. Those are that's the percussion and the main title theme. So what happened to those buckets after you guys recorded?
Well, I have to call my drummer and ask him.
Okay.
But it's a good question. And to the, going back to buckets for a second, you know, when I turned in that theme to John originally, the note back from, there were multiple notes that came back from producers. Fogelman called me and he said, how do you make this as tough as possible? Very Fogelman note. He always wants me to go as big as I possibly can. I'm always pushing to be small. So he said, how big can you go? Jess, another producer, said, how do you make it more New York? And taking those two things, and John also said it too. And I think, like, you know, you realize that in this show, you know, you're living in this, like the building itself is a character, right? It's a pre-war building. You have people that are grandfathered into like $400 a month rent, and then you have people who are super wealthy who live there. And so there's this dichotomy of rich and poor, and there's a socioeconomic diversity to the building and to New York generally. And so that was a moment to convey that in the score.
Yeah, it's like
and
the
so,
busters, like just
yeah.
playing.
And so James McAllister, amazing drummer who plays with the National and Sufjan Stevens, good friend of mine who plays with me a bunch. I asked him to get some Home Depot buckets and play this groove over the theme, and it's like he's like jamming on it, and it sounds like somebody in the subway playing.
Definitely.
He mic'd up his kit. I don't know what he's done with it. They're probably in his garage.
Text him right now and find out.
I will. They're in his garage somewhere, but I'll text him. I'll find out.
Well, Sid, it was great speaking with you. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll see you back in a little bit.
Thanks, Joyce.
Thank you.